U.S. has been asking Prime Minister Maliki for years to be more inclusive. You've asked him to do it, and he's failed. So should he resign at this point? How much more time should he be given? And is the U.S. any closer to delivering the kind of help that the Free Syrian Army is asking for in its battle against ISIS?
Well, Margaret, it's up to the people of Iraq to decide the future of their government, not the United States. And it is a fact, well known, that we have been pushing for certain reforms for a period of time. But more importantly, people in Iraq have been asking for these reforms for a period of time.
Secretary of State John Kerry responding to that question moments ago as far as the future of Nouri al-Maliki, the Prime Minister of Iraq. Secretary Kerry really echoing President Obama's message earlier today when he said it's not our business to choose leaders. Here he was from earlier today.
Above all, Iraqi leaders must rise above their differences and come together around a political plan for Iraq's future. Shia, Sunni, Kurds, all Iraqis must have confidence that they can advance their interests and aspirations through the political process rather than through violence.
Again, that was the president a little while ago announcing he is prepared to send up to 300 military advisors into Iraq to try to help Iraq stop this onslaught of Sunni militants. But before we push ahead, brief history. 6000 BC, desert nomads had an idea. They gave up wandering, and between two rivers, they declared they were home. They built shelters, they grew crops, they traded amongst themselves, they even started keeping records, history, as it were. Fast forward through the millennia, after World War I, that spot where humans first established roots became a country we now know as Iraq. Its boundaries drawn not by its own people, but rather by European diplomats, with scant regard to the fact that their newly minted Iraqis had developed a long history of fighting each other. Saddam Hussein, you might recall, frightened Iraqis so much so that for most of his 24 years in power, they suspended their mutual hatred. But since his overthrow at the hands of U.S. forces, Iraq, despite strenuous efforts by the U.S., is back to trying to settle its age-old score. So Bobby Ghosh, formerly of Time Magazine, now managing editor of Quartz. Bobby Ghosh, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. I really wanted to have this smart segment on the current play, but also looking at history. And it's true, Iraq's troubles start and perhaps even end with the map that was drawn after World War I. Would you agree?
Well, yes, it is certainly true that the British and French cartographers drew maps all over the Middle East, in fact, all over the colonial world that, if you look back today, make no sense at all. But let's not forget there are many countries that were created with that sort of whimsical map making that have held together pretty well, and don't have the kinds of problems that Iraq had. So it's not simply a question of a bad map making that brought Iraq to where it is today. It's also a succession of poor leaders, two very devastating wars, one against Iran, and then, of course, the more recent war against the U.S. and coalition forces, and then some really terrible government after the war by the person who's now Prime Minister, Nouri Maliki. So, yes, history is very important, but it is part of a continuum of extremely poor governance by over millennia, if you like, that
Absolutely.
brought Iraq to where it is today.
You mentioned al-Maliki, you mentioned leadership. So, again, I go back the 100 years after the Europeans established Iraq, established this government, established some rules. It's as though it's still happening. These outside powers, these outside forces trying to make the rules for Iraq. And the White House is saying, it wants a new leader there.
Well, it's certainly saying that between the lines. And the White House is not alone. There are plenty of people much closer to Iraq in its own neighborhood that are saying the same things. And frankly, it's hard to think of a democratic country in the world where a leader loses large amounts of territory to a terrorist group, thousands of his people die, his soldiers give up the battle and run away, and that leader still stays in government. In most democratic countries, that leader would have, in shame and humiliation, would have either resigned from government or would have been driven out of government by his own political party. And it's astonishing that Maliki is still Prime Minister of Iraq. And the longer he is Prime Minister of Iraq, he is clearly a very divisive figure. He's not, to use the words of a former president, he's not a uniter, he is a divider.
How can you guarantee, if ultimately Maliki goes away, who could? Are there names being thrown out? I haven't read any, whether it be it Sunni, Kurd, Shia, who could lead the country as a uniter?
Yes, that is very much a problem. It is clear that Maliki is not the right man for the job. Who is? That is much harder. The one name that keeps coming up is of his predecessor, Iyad Allawi, but he didn't prove to be a particularly adept administrator either. What seems very clear, and we've seen similar situations in other parts of the world, in a situation like this, when the country is in danger of being ripped apart, you need some sort of a national coalition government that brings together all political movements, all political streams under one common banner. If you're lucky, then you have a charismatic, statesman-like leader in the middle who can rule. But if you're not lucky, at least if you have all parties under a common tent, you have the different groups talking to each other politically. In Iraq, you plainly don't have that. Maliki simply refuses to talk to the Sunni political leadership. Never mind the terrorists, the bona fide Sunni political leaders. He had a Sunni vice president. He issued an arrest warrant against him. The vice president had to flee the country. That is not a way you include people. That is how you push them away.
Bobby Ghosh, managing editor of Quartz. You have to imagine the White House is evaluating and watching Nouri al-Maliki each and every day right now. Thank you so much for joining me. And now to this terror group in Iraq. ISIS considers itself a state, and it appears the so-called government has a leaker. It appears. Take a look at this article from the Daily Beast calling, quote, "Someone is spilling ISIS's secrets on Twitter." It's about the account at Wiki Baghdadi, which has been revealing insider details for more than the last 6 months about ISIS's covert alliances, names of leaders, and more. So who is behind the account? Joining me now, the author of this article, Jacob Siegel, Army veteran and reporter and editor at the Daily Beast. So Jacob, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
This at Wiki Baghdadi, who is this person or persons, and is what this individual is claiming via Twitter actually being carried out?
Well, nobody knows exactly who's behind the account. It's an anonymous account, but clearly it's not a disinterested party. It's not somebody looking to just relate objective truths about ISIS. It's probably most likely somebody who belongs to one of ISIS's Islamist rivals, likely in Syria, probably the Nusra Front. So it's somebody whose intent is to smear ISIS, and by smear, I don't mean point to the group's brutality, but to smear it in terms that would undermine it to other Islamist followers.
That is the perfect segue, because what jumped out at me in your piece, the obvious question is, well, why? Why is this person? What are the motivations? You write, whoever is behind the tweets isn't motivated by an allegiance to truth or the idea that it can be liberated and spoken to power, like a mafioso complaining that his fellow hitman failed to play by the rules. It's not the murders that bother Wiki Baghdadi, but the way they're carried out. How do you mean, Jacob?
Well, I mean that the bulk of the account's complaints really focus actually on the formation of ISIS and its split from the Nusra Front, which is the Al-Qaeda affiliated group in Syria. And this is actually really something that goes back to ISIS's involvement in the Syrian civil war. They'd always been in Iraq. They originated in Iraq, but it wasn't until they got involved in Syria that they gained the strength that allowed them to pull off what they've been doing in Iraq now. And in the course of fighting in Syria, they ended up alienating other jihadi groups, other groups that they'd once had alliances with. And there's really been a back and forth effort on Twitter, information operations from various factions seeking to discredit one another. And what Wiki Baghdadi seems to have been doing, among other things, was pointing to some of the Ba'athist ties in ISIS, Baathists being Saddam Hussein's party. Right. So an Arab nationalist party. And by pointing to those ties, it was seeking to discredit the religious authority and the credentials that ISIS had by suggesting that high-level leadership inside ISIS was Ba'athist, or pointing out those ties. Now, as it turns out, ISIS's ability to take over the second largest city in Iraq, Mosul, and to spread as quickly as it has is due largely to the fact that it isn't acting alone,
right.
That it's part of a broader Sunni coalition that certainly involves Ba'athist groups. So while this account was seeking to discredit ISIS, it clearly didn't work even amongst perhaps a receptive audience in the jihadi community. ISIS has only gotten more popular.
Gaining all this traction. Much of it is because of this propaganda, but it's really war crime documentation, what they've been putting out in the ether and on the internet. Jacob Siegel from the Daily Beast, thank you so much. Just it's an interesting angle of this whole story that's playing out in Iraq. Thank you. Coming up next, the main suspect in the Benghazi attacks on a ship back to the U.S. is being questioned right now. We will talk live to an interrogation expert about what could be happening on board this ship.